at the WHO Europe. My name is Elmira Gurbanova. I'm the coordinator of the Virtual Medical Consilium, and today we are going to discuss the 2022 update of the WHO drug-resistant TB treatment guideline. Today, we will have three speakers, and after that, we will have a Q&A session where you'll be able to ask all your questions directly to the speakers and the panelists. But please jot down your questions while the people are presenting in the chat so that we can summarize them and ask all of them during the Q&A session. I would like to remind you that this webinar will be held in Russian with simultaneous interpretation into English. You can select the language you prefer to both listen in and to view the slides. And all the PPTs are available following the link published in the chat. Later, we will also publish the audio recording of the webinar. And I would like to remind Alexander about the technicalities of the webinar, how to select the language. Thank you, Elmira. Today's webinar will be held in two languages. Therefore, we'd like to ask you first to select the language you are going to listen in. There is a sign, a globe in the panel in your Zoom. And also, we will share slides in both English and Russian, and you will be able to select the language of the slides as well. You can find the view option at the top of the screen, and you can select one of the shared screen. For every presenter, we will have slides in both languages. The presenter will share the slides in the preferred language, and our colleagues at WHO Europe will share the translated slides, and you'll be able to choose whichever you prefer. I hope that you'll face no technical difficulties. And the instructions will be in the chat. To start the webinar, I'm very glad to pass the mic to Dr. Askar Yedilbayev, who is the team lead of infectious disease at WHO Europe. Thank you, Elmira. Dear colleagues, good day. We are very glad to welcome you, as Elmira has mentioned, at our 20th webinar of the Virtual Medical Consilium on the treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis. And today's topic is the one we've been waiting for. It's a topical for our European region, where we have a high burden, multi-drug resistant, rifampicin resistant B, and unfortunately the burden is still a very serious issue. Therefore, the recent update of the drug-resistant TB treatment guideline can be viewed as a revolutionary recommendations which can help countries with high burden of tuberculosis, and not only first to address the issue in a proper way and ensure proper coverage with a short, effective, adequate treatment all patients who need this type of treatment. So without further ado, I would like to pass the mic to Elmira to cover the program of the webinar. Thank you, Askar. Our first speaker, Dr. Fuad Mirzayev, who is the team lead at the headquarters of the WHO Europe. Today, we have a unique opportunity to learn about the key updates and the evidence behind the recommendations in the updated guidelines. And I welcome everyone to leave the questions in the chat. Thank you, Elmira. Thank you, Askar. I will try to dive deep into details in my presentations and touch not only about the recommendations, but also cover the principles behind the recommendations, recommendations, and I will try to explain why the recommendations were made by the experts. My presentation will be in English. Unfortunately, I had limited time to get prepared in Russian, but I would like to warn you in advance that all the questions could be answered in Russian, but interpretation will be available. As Alexander has mentioned, you will need to switch to the interpretation channel. So I'm sharing my slides. So do you see the slides in the full screen mode? Yes, we see it in full screen mode.
Okay, so I'm switching to English, and then, as I said, we can have a session, question answer session in Russian. So just to say, a few slides to preface the details is about the guidelines and handbooks that WHO has been developing. It's really already a long history of the guidelines since late 90s. We have been in WHO releasing a number of guidelines and recommendations with those guidelines, and later in the years 2017, 2019, and 20, we've been consolidating them into more centralized documents that have all the recommendations. They are still separated in modules on drug-susceptible TB and drug-resistant TB, and you will see that this division is becoming less and less strict as we go into the future, but the 2022 guidelines, that consolidated guidelines on drug-resistant TB, are probably the latest consolidated guidelines that we have. So just again, few words on the new developments in last year in 2022, since this was the year that we released 3 sets of the consolidated guidelines. One on drug-susceptible TB, both the guideline and the handbook, and they are mainly consolidation of previous recommendations, but also adding 2 4-month-long regimens for treatment of drug-susceptible TB. We have separated the TB care and support guidelines and added a new handbook on TB care and support, something that we never had before. And also the final consolidation was on drug-resistant TB, where it has some really new recommendations on 6-month BPaL-M regimen and modifications in the 9-month regimen. So a few slides on the base of the data that we had available for the review in the guideline development group meeting that we had in February-March 2022. So one big the group of the data that was analyzed was the data from TB Practical trial led by MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the data that comes from 3 sites of this clinical trial in Uzbekistan, South Africa, and Belarus. Several regimens that were used during that trial, because it is multiple arm, multiple stage trial. That's a specific type of the clinical trial. In the first stage, the TB Practical had 3 regimens: the BPaL with moxifloxacin, BPaL with clofazimine, and just BPaL. All of them used for 24 weeks. So kind of slightly, just a little bit less than 6 months. Then in the stage 2, the one regimen out of those 3 was retained. That was BPaL-M, BPaL with moxifloxacin. And BPaL, as you know, means bedaquiline, predominant, and linezolid. The comparator, and this clinical trial had a comparator was a standard of care regimen in these three countries. It was not homogeneous, so it was not the same. It was ranging from 9 months to the longer regimens, 18, 20 months, but all of those regimens were regimens recommended by WHO. So again, the schematic presentation of the timeline of this trial, because it also had the follow-up until 72, at least 72 weeks after the start of the regimen, and some follow-up continued for the stage 2. I hear that some people have not muted, so please mute your microphones because we have some noise in the background. Another bulk of data that we received in WHO was the data from the Zinix trial by TB Alliance with 4 sites in Georgia, Moldova, Russia, and South Africa. And I think it's important to mention the sites because many of those sites are very relevant for the European region in both TB Practical and Zinix trial. In Zinix trial, this trial, although it is called clinical trial and it was done as clinical trial, it just doesn't have any comparator. However, it has 4 arms with 4 regimens, all of them BPaL, but with different duration of linezolid or different dose of linezolid. And we'll come to the point how we use this data, of course. There was a big massive of data that we received from South Africa for, since you might know, or you may not know that South Africa was switched into the 9-month regimen back in 2016-17, the one with ethionamide, but in the second half of 2018, they changed this regimen and replaced ethionamide with linezolid. Since it was our interest, we received all the data from South Africa starting for the whole year of 19. And of course, we used the comparator that also the data from South Africa for the regimen with ethionamide, the one that you can see on screen. I would also want to acknowledge the data that we received from many countries, and many countries again in the European region, and thank you for that, from the public call for data that we released in, I think back in 21, most probably, yes, it was in 21. And that was a programmatic data on the use of WHO recommended regimen. So basically 9-month regimen. Also, the South Africa sent the data within for this public call, but also there was a programmatic data from Belarus, Georgia, India, Moldova, Mozambique, Papua New Guinea, Russian Federation, and Somalia. And we also had the data from the field work by MSF in several countries, as well as the so-called NTP project that is led by MSF and Partners in Health. So that's the basis of data that led to the update of the guidelines and the 2 sections that have mainly updated were section 1 on 6-month BPaL-M and section 2 on the 9-month regimen. Minor changes in the longer regimens that we can discuss if you want, but we have also updated the handbook in parallel. So in this presentation, and given the time that we have, I will focus on the BPaL-M regimen, but again, we can discuss a little bit about the 9-month or longer regimens if someone has a question. So there was quite a very thorough and many so-called PICO questions that have been reviewed. The PICO questions are the questions that we have to use for the review when using the mechanism for recommendations review, that it's so-called the GRADE mechanism. So PICO questions means population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. So that's why we always need to have the intervention regimen, the comparator regimen or group of regimens, and look at the outcomes. When we look at the outcomes in the analysis, we are looking at desirable and undesirable. Of course, the efficacy of the regimen and safety of the regimen come out as first, but other parameters are also being looked at, like the cost effectiveness, feasibility, etc. So many questions we had to look at to be comprehensive in this review. You see them on the screen. And different, each of these questions, the question 3, 4, 5, and 6, because there were more for this guideline development, but I'm just showing those that are related to BPaL-M recommendation. So you understand the process that we went through. So the first set of questions, actually 4 reviews that were done, it was a massive work. It was on the dosing of linezolid. For that, mostly the data from the Zinix trial was used, comparing different regimens within that trial. And basically, all of them have been compared to each other. And at the end, you can see that on some of the these reviews, the recommendation was against the intervention, meaning, for example, if we take the first line, against the BPaL when it has 1,200 milligrams of linezolid only for 9 weeks, because when BPaL, the comparator with 1,200, but for 26 weeks, it was better, had the better outcomes, the ones that I described. And sometimes it was 4. But at the end, as a summary of all these recommendations, the logical summary that the GDG, Guideline Development Group, came up was that these reviews allowed a selection of the regimen that had the most appropriate dosing in terms of both efficacy and the safety. And that was linezolid of 600 milligram for 26 weeks, roughly 6 months. So the next set was for the different group of patients, the patients with both MDR-TB and quinolone resistant, so-called pre-XDR-TB, and according to current definition, and comparing the BPaL to the longer regimens. It was in favor of the BPaL. The number 5, several comparisons, and these comparisons resulted basically in favor of BPaL when compared to the both 9-month regimens with ethionamide or linezolid and the longer regimen. The most important was the group of questions number 6, where the most important again was the one 6.1, that BPaL-M within the TB practical trial was compared to the group of standard of care regimens within that regimen, and it was in favor of BPaL-M. We have, for the comprehensiveness, we have tried to compare the BPaL-M with BPaL with moxifloxacin to BPaL with clofazimine and with just BPaL within that trial. And as you can see, it was all these comparisons directed in favor of BPaL-M. But BPaL without neither moxifloxacin or clofazimine has also fared quite well. So all that led to this summary recommendation. I want to reiterate that. A summary recommendation that is implementable. Of course, it's much more difficult to use these separate recommendations because they all logically end with the suggestion to use the 6-month treatment regimen, that BPaL-M, BPaL with moxifloxacin, rather than, meaning in preference to the 9-month or the longer 18-20-month regimen. It is a conditional recommendation with the low certainty of evidence because of the amount of data was not overwhelming. Basically, all these trials are hundreds of patients. They are not thousands of patients. But let's look at the what it means in terms of the remarks, because remarks really outline what to do in terms of implementation. For example, patient selection. Patient selection is, since this is a new regimen, and all the experience that we have is mostly from these two clinical trials. Of course, there is some operational research that is going on, but we used a lot the selection criteria of these trials that you can see on the left side to try and put together for whom this regimen can be used, BPaL-M or BPaL. And that's people with MDR-TB or MDR-TB and resistance to quinolones, so-called pre-XDR-TB. It should be patients with confirmed pulmonary TB, but some forms of extrapulmonary are also can be included. I'll come to that in more detail. Because Zinix and Practical had slightly different inclusion age, Practical above 15 years old and Zinix above 14 years old, the expert group eventually decided that since it was used in those 14 years old, we should set the threshold at 14 years old and older. Again, that was both trials included people with co-infection with HIV, and the patient selection was protected by not including patients with possible resistance to bedaquiline, linezolid, pretomine, delamanid. That means that exposure should have been less than 1 month. So if we wrap that into the subgroup considerations and which groups can use this regimen. So people living with HIV, it can be used, but some drug interactions should be considered. It can be used on children and adolescents rather, above 14 years old. It is restricted for those pregnant mainly because of pretomine, because this is a new drug and there is no good experience of using that drug in pregnant women. And it can be used in some forms extrapulmonary TB, but since no data was available, no evidence, we exclude for now the severe forms of extrapulmonary TB, like for example the TB meningitis, osteoarticular TB, and miliary TB. There is a need to confirm rifampicin resistance for the patients that I enrolled on this regimen. The DST to fluoroquinolones is desirable, and ideally we should have it, but to adjust the regimen, so basically if there is resistance to quinolones, to drop moxifloxacin, but basically the regimen can also start as BPaL-M and then modified if quinolone resistance is identified. So without delay, basically waiting for the DST. The assessment of TB disease is needed because the pulmonary TB patients mainly with some possibility of using that for certain forms that I mentioned of extrapulmonary TB. There is some interesting nuance in the regimen composition and dosing, because the dosing is pretty much standard except for bedaquiline, that we also included a possibility of alternative dosing for bedaquiline, the one that was used in the Zinix trial, that possibly make it easier for programmatic implementation, because it's daily throughout. It's not daily for 2 weeks, then 200 milligrams 3 times a week. It's daily throughout. Also, the dose, as you can see, is higher for the first 8 weeks, then it goes to 100 milligram daily. The duration, again, some nuances. If a regimen is as BPaL with moxifloxacin and there is no resistance to quinolones, it can last for 6 months or 26 weeks. If regimen is modified to become BPaL, there is a possibility of extending that regimen by 3 months to the total duration of 9 months, if there is any indication of slow progress in patient condition. So basically, it can be 39 weeks. Some additional implementation considerations that I am sure that many may have a question, since there are some medicines like linezolid that are known to lead to some serious adverse effects. So, so that's why in the operational handbook, we added several kind of general considerations that if both bedaquiline or pretomanic needs to be discontinued for whatever reason, that means the regimen has to be stopped. It's a failure of the regimen. If linezolid needs to be, if there is some adverse events to linezolid, depending on the severity of those adverse events, it can be either decreased to from 600 to 300, or if it needs to be permanently stopped, if it happens like earlier than after the 8 weeks that remaining for the whole treatment, that shouldn't be a problem, because regimen in these trials that what happened. Many patients had discontinued linezolid, but at least 9 consecutive weeks of treatment are required with linezolid from the beginning. Again, as moxifloxacin, if moxifloxacin needs to be stopped, that's not a problem. The regimen can continue as BPaL without moxifloxacin. So for then there are, of course, some times where patients are like every other day for consecutive several weeks, they interrupt the treatment. So more than 2 weeks of interruption of all medicine means that the regimen change is needed. It has to be switched to another one. So it probably, this patient cannot take it anymore. If it is non-consecutive, that it happened here and there throughout of these 6 months, if it is more than 1 month or more than 4 weeks cumulatively, so it is interruption of all medicines, again, the regimen change needs to be considered. The monitoring doesn't really differ from other MDR-TB regimens. With smear microscopy and culture, ADSM framework applies, and the outcome definitions that were updated in 2020 can be used for this regimen as well. So maybe I'll stop here, Elmira, and take questions before if we have additional time, we can go into the discussion about the 9-month oral regimens. That there are 2 options, but for now, maybe we take questions on that, because I've already taken a lot of time.
Большое спасибо, Fuad.
Thank you very much, Fuad. You met the requirements of our schedule very precisely. I don't see any questions in chat so far, but dear participants, should you have any questions, you can write them down in chat, and by the end of the presentations, we will have a session for questions and answers, and we will discuss all of them, getting them from the chat. Now I can ask one question from the chat from Guljan Gulepova. With what treatment regimens you can use pyridoxine 50 milligrams daily? Basically, pyridoxine is worthwhile using when you use ethionamide. Most likely that will be a 9-month treatment regimen. This is an option with ethionamide. And if linezolid is used, according to the WHO guidelines for prevention of adverse events such as peripheral neuropathy or myelosuppression, it was recommended to use pyridoxine daily. Yes, in principle, we have certain evidence that says that this medicine prevents some severe adverse events of linezolid. And those patients who start having a serious anemia or neuropathy or some ophthalmological adverse events, those patients will hardly benefit from this medicine. We have another question. What kind of criteria should be used for determination of treatment outcomes with the use of BPaL? Criteria are the same as for other treatment regimens. But we tried to provide more details in the operational handbook on how to interpret treatment failure. And that was mainly due to those parameters that I have mentioned earlier. So whether there is a need to stop using preparedness and bedaquiline, for example, then the treatment outcome will be considered as unfavorable, meaning that we would have to consider another treatment option. In the guidelines, you can find a more detailed information on how to define treatment failure with the use of BPaL. However, in general, we can say that we will be using the same treatment outcomes as for other treatment regimens. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for writing down your questions in the chat. And now we will continue following the program and we'll give the floor to the next speaker. At the end of our presentations, we will have a session for questions and answers. Now, it is my pleasure to give a floor to Dr. Oleksandr Korotych, who is a technical officer of the joint program of the WHO Euro. She will replace our colleague who was not able to join us for some reason. And Mr. Korotych was kind to make that presentation on her behalf. Thank you very much, Elmira. Indeed, I had to replace our colleague, Nino Lomtadze, but I will try to deliver the main idea of this presentation. Dear colleagues, today we will be talking about the preparedness of our countries for the introduction of the shorter treatment regimens for treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis. In this presentation, we will tell you about the questionnaire for assessment that we used in the fall of 2022. And the purpose of it was to understand different scenarios for introduction and implementation of novel 6-month treatment regimens under routine programmatic conditions in high TB priority countries. That survey was based on the questionnaire developed by the WHO Working Group on the implementation of the shorter treatment regimens. We brought together a subgroup of experts that developed a questionnaire with some very important aspects that are important for the use of BPaL-M and BPaL under routine programmatic conditions. So we focused on the national treatment policy, service delivery, drug supply and management, laboratory diagnosis, monitoring, and evaluation. The purpose of that analysis was to inform the WHO and other international partners and funding institutions on the kind of financial and technical support that will be needed for the rollout of these treatment regimens. And also, we wanted to give an opportunity to the national TB control programs to revisit existing challenges and reinforce further solutions. I will not focus on this slide in a lot of details. This group was developed by our group on the introduction of modified shorter treatment regimens. And the same group also developed the algorithm for triage of patients that will be relevant for our region in light of the implementation of modified shorter treatment regimens that are being implemented in the 13 countries of our region. We invited all high priority countries in the WHO Europe, but we received responses from 6 countries, and you see them on this slide. That is Belarus, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Republic of Moldova, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine. And we're very grateful to these countries for their participation and answers to the questions. Now, let us look at this questionnaire. All these countries already have some experience in the implementation of the modified shorter treatment regimens. These are modifications to the standard shorter treatment regimens in the operational conditions. They are applicable to patients with MDR-TB without resistance to fluoroquine alone. Those countries already had experience in using shorter treatment regimens. And those countries had experience in BPaL implementation in the framework of the operational conditions or in the programmatic conditions. Georgia started doing it even before the WHO made its recommendation on the use BPaL available. We also reviewed the national adaptation of the WHO guidelines. 4 countries reported on the lack of direct mechanism for adaptation of the WHO policy. So in order to use the WHO recommendations, the national guidelines are to be approved first, and only after that the new treatment regimens can be used. Uzbekistan and Ukraine said that they used this mechanism, and now the fact that there is a WHO recommendation is a sign for following them in the country conditions. 4 out of these 6 countries have been implementing MSTR treatment regimens, while we see countries who did not report that. We also had a question about the salvage regimen that is included in the updated guidelines, and all countries said that this regimen is in place and it is part of the national guidelines. We also asked the patients about the distribution of patients for treatment with shorter and longer treatment regimens, and the countries provided the reports which show that standard shorter treatment regimens are not widely used in our region. It was recommended in the guidelines of 2021. They were used in Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, and Republic of Moldova. As you know, the treatment regimen had some limitations because of the resistant profile, and the WHO Euro had initiative to implement MSTR operational research. As you can see, Belarus and Georgia showed that more than 65% of patients received MSTR treatment regimen. In Kyrgyzstan, in Moldova, and Uzbekistan and Ukraine, these percentages are slightly lower. On this slide, you can also see that the longer treatment regimens were quite common, and this treatment regimen was mainly used in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. So there is room for the rollout of MSTR treatment regimens and BPaL-M treatment regimens. Those patients who receive treatment regimens of 18 and 20 months long, if they have MDR-TB, have an opportunity to be treated under shorter treatment regimens if they meet the criteria. We also assess the percentage of patients with MDR-TB who received BPaL treatment regimens. You can see that the numbers are quite low, although the resistance to fluoroquinolone in those countries was quite high. And you can see that about 9% of patients received the salvage regimen. At present, of those 6 countries, and that is relevant to September, October of 2022, the countries plan to continue BPaL treatment regimen study, and most likely they will give that up in preference to the programmatic implementation of BPaL treatment regimen. We also analyzed the current care delivery models, and we could see that the majority of the countries reported a very high percentage of patients who were hospitalized for treatment. On average, that was 86% in the region, and the general duration of hospitalization was shown on this slide. So we can optimize this process and introduce video-supported treatment. The average coverage with the VCT was 35%, which shows that we can expand this approach even further. Also, all countries noted that because of the operational research of MSTR and because of the programmatic practice, there is a good system of active monitoring of drug safety in place. There is a system in place for monitoring and reporting of safety. Only Moldova reported on the lack of DOT during the weekend. The rest of the countries noted that that system was well developed because they already had that experience in the operational research activities. And the same requirement will be in place for the programmatic implementation of BPaL. Only half of the countries had a registration of bedaquiline and linezolid, that is Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Ukraine. Moxifloxacin is registered in all countries. Preparedness was registered in 5 out of 6 countries. Registration is pending in Moldova. So in the majority of the countries, these drugs are registered. Preparedness, which is the key component of this treatment regimen, is quite good, except Moldova, and our colleagues will be working on it. The funding sources of these regimen drugs are different. That could be the government sources and the Global Fund. MSF provides assistance in Belarus. All countries noted that the available financing will be sufficient for procurement of drugs in order to roll out these treatment regimens in the countries. 5 out of 6 countries said that they plan countrywide implementation of the BPaL or BPaL-M regimens, and Uzbekistan will use these treatment regimens in the pilot regions. Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan report that they already started enrollment of patients for treatment with the use of BPaL-M regimen. Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine plan to offer official recommendations or in the first quarter of 2023. But as I said, we performed that survey in the fall of 2022, and now we see that there are some changes. For example, Ukraine is already introducing BPaL under programmatic conditions. It is expected that in total, about 1,400 patients will be enrolled for treatment with the use of these treatment regimens. There is a WHO mechanism for importing unregistered pharmaceutical products into the country. And Kyrgyzstan has all BPaL-M drugs registered. All countries conducted an assessment of the drug need, and this information was shared with the donors and the Global Drug Facility. As for the WHO recommended molecular diagnosis, more than 90% of cases were tested for the second-line DST and with the use of a second-line Hein test, which provides the availability of quick results for DST to fluoroquine alone. In a number of countries, the guidelines were updated in line with the WHO guidelines, so they are in line with the new recommendations now. But also some countries noted that in order to update the treatment algorithms and in order to update requirements for triage, they will need some technical support. All countries have access to phenotypic DST for the drugs of BPaL-M plus the Lamanid. Some countries also noted the lack of finances for procurement of laboratory agents, and they need to rely on the Global Fund grants and other donor support. In conclusion, it should be noted that all countries that participated in the survey are ready to include the recommendations on the programmatic use of BPaL-M 6-month treatment regimen into their national guidelines. 4 countries will continue using MSTR treatment regimens in the operational research conditions for the target groups, such as children under 14, pregnant women, and some other groups of patients. Also, as far as we know, the supply of preparedness available for the countries will not be able to meet the needs of all countries, and either this year or next year, MSTR treatment regimens will be used in the conditions of the operational research. Shorter treatment regimens was used in 45% of patients, and 11% of patients were treated under the salvage regimen. The duration of hospitalization is quite long, on average 83 days, and so there is a need to expand the use of video-supported treatment. At present, this approach is used only in 35% of patients. Now the countries say that they have a good ADSM framework in place, and they also report on uninterrupted supply of the drugs, meaning that countries will be able to procure the drugs for BPaL-M for their programmatic use. Also, there is a good access to the rapid DSTs, and more than 90% of cases are covered with this testing, which lays a good foundation for the use of these treatment regimens in line with the recommendations. At the same time, there are some challenges with the financing of drug procurement, and we would have to continue working on that. In general, we can say that the introduction of MSTR and BPaL treatment regimens prepared the countries for the rapid rollout BPaL-M treatment regimens in the programmatic conditions. Thank you very much, dear participants, and I thank the countries that participated in this survey. Special thanks goes to the WHO Euro region MSTR task force and BPaL-M subgroup, as well as the technical advisors and all those who participated in that survey. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexander, for an excellent summary on the preparedness of 6 countries for the implementation of the shorter treatment regimens and on the specifics of BPaL. I also thank the participants for the questions in the chat. Special thanks go to Fuad Mirzayev, who started answering some of the questions. However, we will make them public during the questions and answers sessions. So after we heard about the recommendations and about the preparedness of the countries to implement those recommendations, I believe it will be interesting to know about the early experience on the implementation of these new treatment regimens in the country conditions. And we give the floor to Alena Skrahina, who will share the Belarus experience. Alena, please, the floor is yours. Yes, we can see your slides. Excellent. Alena, we cannot hear you. Dear colleagues, can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you very well. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share the Belarus experience in the introduction of BPaL or BPaL-M treatment regimens and their scale up in the country. Today, we already heard the information about the new WHO guidelines. You can see that some of them are relevant to treatment of rifampicin-resistant tuberculosis, dated December 2022. And we included all latest WHO recommendation because we prepared the legislation basis for the introduction of all novelties related to diagnosis and treatment of tuberculosis. Having legislation is not enough. In order to move on, we need to have rapid molecular diagnosis in place, and we know that very well. So on this slide, you can see the introduction of the new molecular diagnosis. Following the WHO recommendations, we ensured molecular diagnosis to the first and second line drugs. They should be available for more than 90% of cases. And of course, we are interested in the time from diagnosis to the start of treatment. So we perform DSTs to the first and second line drugs, including bedaquiline, linezolid, lamanid. We also understand that we need to provide training in order to roll out this testing. We have been collecting MTB strains since 2015. And we try to make sure that our patients receive DST results within no more than 2 weeks. For the introduction of the new treatment regimens, we need to have active drug safety monitoring in place. And we also need to ensure good interaction with the pharmacovigilance system. We have a lot of experience in the use of active drug safety monitoring, and we use the full package of that system. We started using the cohort monitoring in 2016. And as soon as we started using shorter treatment regimens, we introduced the intermediate package. Now all countries have active drug safety monitoring in place because of the WHO operational research of shorter treatment regimens. Another very important element for the introduction of the shorter treatment regimens is the video observed treatment. We also have quite a lot of experience in this field, and we understand very well that even for modified shorter treatment regimens, which are being applied in all countries of our regions, we need to ensure treatment 7 days a week so that patients could receive all doses within a short number of weeks. And so it will not be possible unless we have video observed treatment 7 days a week. On this slide, you can see the number of patients who received video observed treatment.
You see all the drugs are available because of the support of the Global Fund, the state and MSF. And using the opportunity, I would like to thank MSF, especially for their support with the predominant supply. Predominant linezolid are registered in the country, and since 2019, we've been using fully oral treatment regimens. And you see this pink circle growing by 2022. 78% of all patients have been taking on 2 types of key shorter treatment regimens, MSTR and BPaL. So a huge percentage of patients have been taking on these 2 regimens. Why have we switched to the new treatment regimen so easily? Because we, as you in your countries, have acquired huge experience in the area of operational research on modified shorter treatment regimens. Another important aspect is the work of the rifampicin-resistant TB Consilium, and we switched to online work in 2020. We also perform regular monitoring visits, and we have successfully implemented modified shorter treatment regimens. You see the distribution. The regional cohort, which is pretty big, it ranks second by the size, with the Ukrainian being the first. Our regional cohorts shows the treatment success rate at the level of 91%. And this regional initiative, which we are all part of, which enables our patients to be treated for a relatively short period of time compared with BPaL. shorter, 9 months. It helped us to acquire pretty good skills in the area of active drug safety monitoring. We've also acquired tools. We can assess neurological status and vision acuity and light color perception, not using specialty physicians. And the monitoring template has turned out to be a very useful tool as well for quality monitoring. And our experience in BPaL use is quite long. We started with clinical trial in 2018 and we finished in 2021. And then we switched to operational research last year. We started it in 2022. And as for clinical trial, we started long ago of BPaL treatment regimen. You can have a look at the characteristics of the patients. We were not quite picky. 10.6% were HIV positive. Why not picky? Because we were not trying to exclude patients with risk factors. 1 of 5 abuses alcohol. Many, namely 18.2, had low body mass index. Many had diabetes mellitus. 1 in 3 was smear positive, had huge bacterial load. About 40% had bilateral lung involvement, and 1 in 5 had cavities. But despite all those risk factors, treatment success was 85.7, and it would have been higher, but we had very strict enrollment criteria, as with every clinical trial. It's more stringent than a regular clinical trial. The treatment monitoring for BPaL, it is well known. It's quite easy to use within MSTR work. You see that recommendations are the same to detect adverse events. We assess the severity, where they're serious. It's the work we are well used to do within MSTR work, and it simplifies data entry as well. Now let's switch to the operational research and enrollment into BPaL. On the 2nd of March 2022, the first patient was enrolled. The total number of enrolled patients is 197, but I would like to describe those who have already completed their treatment. We have 134 such patients. For all clinicians, very important to have a look at the outcomes. And you can see the majority, as usual, were males. And here you see the age distribution. The majority were 25 to 64. And for us, for the region, it was a pretty new treatment regimen. 23% of patients were previously treated. Not newly detected cases were enrolled. And here you see the characteristics of the patients who have completed their treatment. 1 in 4 abused alcohol. 6% were incarcerated people who either were at the time of the trial in prison or had a history of incarceration. More than 70% had low body mass index. 16.4 had cardiovascular issues. And I would like to draw your particular attention to that for you to understand that the component drugs affect work of cardiovascular system. More than 10% had hepatitis, almost 7% had HIV infection. 30% of the patients were smear positive, 32% had bilateral lung involvement, 40% out of those, almost half, had cavities. of destruction. Now let's talk about the treatment success assessment. Almost all, except for one, patients converted by culture by month 3, and that's outstanding result. Now let's have a look at the treatment outcomes. Treatment success was 94.8%. I think it doesn't need any comments. It's obviously it's as high as it can get. We cannot even expect any higher. It's a very good treatment success rate. Adverse events. You see, the description was interesting for us to observe them. The difference from MSTI is with pancreatitis. But you do the same you are used to do within MSTI work. There are adverse events of a special interest we are quite used to, but perhaps there is the new things are hypothyroidism or pancreatitis, pancreatitis especially, as the result of our work in 134 patients. We had none adverse events of interest, but there were 11 serious adverse events in 9 patients. Now, I would like to touch upon our next steps and plans for the nearest future. In 2023, we plan to implement the work of enroll 75 patients on BPaL-M, and we plan to enroll about 5% of patients on modified shorter treatment regimens. And you know why. Oleksandr has just reminded you, and you might read it in the guidelines, that there will be categories of patients unfitted because of lack of data for BPaL. Children under the age of 14, pregnant and lactating women. And we also keep on longer treatment regimens, about 20% of patients, because there are exceptions. There are people with a severe extrapulmonary TB, people with drug resistance to component drugs, as treatment failure because of lack of conversion or acquired drug resistance. People lost to follow-up or, for example, confirmed intolerability. We have not seen one, but we might face such a case when a person is intolerable to BPaL component drugs, or, for example, some conditions which require individualized approach. And using this opportunity, I would like to remind you that it's all described in the guidelines, described by Fuad. You can use them. I would like to thank our partners, the World Health Organization, MSF, and the Global Fund for an outstanding team without whom this work wouldn't be possible. And I would like to say that many of the people are part of the webinar. Thank you, Alena, for sharing brilliant experience and phenomenal outcomes, which bring hope to all of us that in the nearest future, all countries in the region will be able to use shorter treatment regimens at wide scale and switch to programmatic use of BPaL-M. I see that Fuad has answered many questions, but there are a few questions remaining, and I would like to address them to Alena as a person with a huge experience of managing patients on BPaL-M. I would like to combine the questions. First, BPaL with moxifloxacin, how effective is it in previously treated patients with MDR-TB? And what do you use to treat patients with treatment failure or relapse after BPaL-M. Speaking about us, how effective is it? For patients with relapses, almost 16 of patients are relapses, and we see no difference. I don't hear the speaker. As for failure during treatment, out of 131, we had one death not related to the treatment regimens. So we had no failures. Perhaps if there is acquired resistance, we will need to switch to longer treatment regimens. But we had no failures, not in our current work, not in clinical trials. We had no failures. Thank you very much. One more question, and words of gratitude from the participants for such an interesting presentation and for sharing outstanding experience. Only 40% had cavities. And what clinical form of TB had the rest of the patients in the cohort? The majority had infiltrative TB, infiltrative lung TB, but major processes. We can't say that those were minor forms. It would be incorrect. Infiltrative TB can be different. It can be bilateral. And we had quite many patients with bilateral. Almost 1 in 2 patients enrolled had bilateral TB. Almost 30% of our patients were smear positive, and it may be a sign of not a newly acquired process, and it can be related to the COVID-19 pandemic, because prior to that we had a few such patients. Perhaps the COVID pandemic affected early detention, but we have huge experience in this area, and I would like to say that I saw such TB only at the beginning of my career. The cases are more severe, both susceptible and resistant because of late detection, unfortunately.
From my point of view, and I'm sure that the colleagues from my team will support me, mean that we need to enroll these patients with shorter treatment regimens. We know the characteristics of these patients, and you've seen that every fourth patient in our cohort abused alcohol. And you can imagine how difficult it is to treat these patients during 18 months. And of course, with the shorter treatment regimens, we have better chances to successfully treat them. Thank you very much, Alena. We also have some questions that should probably be addressed to Fuad, because they are related to the guidelines and better understanding of the recommendation. The first question is the reasons for stopping BPaL and switching to longer treatment regimens if linezolid was discontinued before 9 weeks of treatment. In the past, BPaL treatment regimens recommended by the WHO allowed to discontinue linezolid after 4 weeks of application. Thank you. I've seen that question. And I would like to say that in the most recent recommendation, we used more evidence, although it is not sufficient either. We used data on several hundreds of patients enrolled for the clinical trials. I know that there are some other countries that implement the operational research similar to the one in Belarus. This kind of information is very important for us because we try to summarize the implementation experience in order to add some details. But if we use the available evidence from TB Practical and Xinex studies, the best effect of treatment was reported in cases when physicians tried to use at least 9 for at least 9 weeks in the dose of 600 milligrams. If some changes were undertaken after that period of time, and we know that in the majority of cases, side effects of linezolid appear after 2 months of treatment. It will be possible to reduce the dose by half and to address the side effects or to discontinue the use of drugs. But if you do it sooner, it will significantly reduce chances for successful treatment outcome. So you need to remember that this is a short treatment regimen, only 6 months long, and we use a small number of drugs. And linezolid is one of the key drugs in the treatment regimens, and the lack of this drug in the treatment regimens will increase the chances for treatment failure. So the recommendation you've seen is a very careful recommendation, but it was based on the available evidence. Perhaps in the future, we will make some clarifications, but as of now, we cannot do it. Thank you, Fuad. And Alena, in her presentation, showed time to conversion with the use of BPaL treatment regimens. And we can see that quite a big group of patients achieve conversion after the first months of treatment. And the majority of them achieve conversion after 2 months of treatment, while almost all of them achieve conversion after 3 months of treatment. So we know what can be expected if linezolid is discontinued at the early stage of treatment. The next question is about the possibility to use BPaL treatment regimens in patients who are susceptible to tuberculosis if they cannot tolerate rifampicin. I think I already answered that question, but I can repeat it once again. Basically, expanded data on the use of BPaL or BPaL-M in treatment of drug-susceptible tuberculosis is lacking, but we do not have any data to support the idea that this treatment regimen will not be effective. This is an effective treatment regimen in general, and it is not less effective than the 6-month treatment regimen with isoniazid and rifampicin and ethambutol. So it should work in patients with drug-susceptible tuberculosis. So in cases of drug-susceptible tuberculosis, the success rate was quite high with the standard treatment regimens. It was more than 80–90%. And treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis practiced in the past are usually less than 80%, or at least it was in the past like that. Now we were able to move forward and achieve better results with the new treatment regimens. So answering your questions. Of course, we need to make sure that patients have susceptibilities to other drugs in the regimen. And the next question is to Alena again. Could you please share your experience on patients' follow-up if patients received BPaL treatment regimens? So what can you say about the follow-up of those patients? Most likely our colleagues were interested in relapses. Oh yes, thank you very much for your question. I saw that question in the chat. I would like to say that we have quite a lot of experience in the follow-up of patients who received BPaL treatment regimens, because the first patient was enrolled in 2018. We followed up 80 patients in clinical trials. We did not have any relapses, and we continue following those patients, although it's been quite a while since the start of their treatment. We initiated our clinical trial in 2018 in the framework of TB Practical clinical trial, and we completed the follow-up in 2021. And I showed you the calendar to illustrate this situation. And I would like to repeat once again that we did not see any relapses. Thank you very much. This is very promising. The next question is to Fuad. Is it possible to replace moxifloxacin with levofloxacin in case of intolerability or in case of other reasons? I have just seen that question and I shared my answer in the chat. This is the same group of drugs. Of course, there is some cross resistance. In the BPaL-M, where we use levofloxacin instead of moxifloxacin, this data is not available, so I cannot give you any definite answer. But if there is a resistance to fluoroquinolone, I don't see there is any need to make a replacement of moxifloxacin by levofloxacin. I think you can simply exclude moxifloxacin from the treatment regimen. I would like to thank our speakers, Alena, Fuad, Oleksandr. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations, for answering the questions of our audience. Those questions that were not reviewed during the session will be answered later on. And now I would like to give the floor to Oleksandr, who will share a number of interesting slides on shorter treatment regimens. Thank you very much, Elmira. I also want to thank Fuad, who highlighted the role of the operational research data that could be used in the development of guidelines. As for BPaL treatment regimens, WHO Europe provided support to Ukraine and other countries for the implementation of these treatment regimens, and we are looking forward to the follow-up period. And so I would like to ask the countries to remember about the operational research. Please continue generating the evidence that will later on be used by the guideline development group, as Fuad has just mentioned. Many of you had questions about MSTR treatment research. We continue enrolling patients. We have enrolled about 6,000 patients for treatment under modified shorter treatment regimens in the regional cohort and the country cohorts. We continue the enrollment, and we believe that in the regional cohort, which includes 1,800 patients, will be complete soon, and we plan to perform the analysis of the regional cohort. And in 2023, we plan to develop an article where we'll present the data on effectiveness and safety of this treatment regimen, and we ask countries to provide the follow-up data and to finalize the report by the end of this year. And then we will initiate the discussion with Fuad and his colleagues on the future use of this evidence for the development of the WHO guidelines. The technical assistance of the WHO Euro will be continued. We will continue our missions, and the Virtual Medical Consilium will continue providing guidance and advice on treatment of patients. And I would like to thank Elmira and my colleagues who focus on that. Usually it takes about 2 days to provide the recommendations in case of questions. We plan that our countries will continue the use of MSTR treatment regimens, expanding the group of patients. And if pretamamide will not be available in a sufficient amount, you would have to consider using this treatment regimen in the framework of the operational guidelines. And then we will present the results in the report on the regional cohort. Once again, I would like to thank you for the implementation of this initiative. Thank you very much, Alexander. In conclusion, I would like to give the floor to Askar Yedilbayev. Thank you very much, Elmira, dear colleagues, dear speakers. Thank you for highlighting this very important topic. This is very relevant for the whole world and for the European region in particular. As you know, earlier we had a webinar where we were saying that starting with January, we have a new plan for TB control, which describes the main strategic directions that will help us decrease the burden of tuberculosis by 2030. Once again, I would like to remind you that in that plan, we have some intermediate targets that we need to achieve by 2025, meaning that we need to achieve treatment success of MDR-TB and rifampicin-resistant TB at the level of 80% and no lower. The most recent data that we have available for the cohort of 2019, the effectiveness was 57%. So the gap is enormous. So we want to make sure that all activities undertaken by the countries, including activities aimed at expanded access to the new drugs, will allow you to treat your patients safely, effectively, and without any injectable drugs during the shorter time period, which is important for the patients and for the healthcare system. That will help us achieve this target. Actually, this target is not very ambitious. It is quite achievable and realistic. And the updated WHO guidelines issued in December of 2022 will help us in the programmatic implementation of the objectives. Of course, there will be some transition to the new recommendations. It will take some time, and during this transitional period, you would have to continue using those modified shorter treatment regimens. This webinar is record-beating. 312 connections were reported today, but it doesn't mean that 312 people joined the webinar. The actual number of participants is a lot higher, meaning that a lot of people are very active in controlling TB. So the World TB Day is coming. So let us join our efforts in order to overcome this disease. Thank you very much, Askar. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your active participation. And see you soon during our next webinar. All the best to you, and thank you, and goodbye.
До свидания. Спасибо всем.
До свидания.
Спасибо. До свидания.